Imagine this, you're looking up at the sky on a warm summer morning in Athens, Greece. Suddenly, you notice a massive passenger jet circling high above the city, 10,000 meters in the air, completely silent. No radio calls. No communication. Just a ghostly aircraft drifting through the skies. Was it a terrorist attack? A hijacking? Or something far more terrifying? What unfolded that day shocked the entire aviation world and left investigators with one of the strangest and deadliest mysteries in modern airline history. This is the haunting story of Helios Flight 522, better known as the Ghost Plane. Welcome back to Rivo TV. On August 14, 2005, air traffic controllers in Athens noticed something unusual. A Boeing 737, carrying 115 passengers and 6 crew members, had been flying silently for hours. For over 2 straight hours, the jet ignored every single radio call. Not a single response to Athens control, no acknowledgement of repeated emergency frequencies. The Greek Air Force scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept the aircraft. As they approached, the fighter pilots peered into the passenger cabin, and what they saw chilled them to the bone. Inside the cabin, every passenger sat motionless, oxygen masks hanging over their faces. No movement. No life. The cockpit captain's seat? Completely empty. But then, a man appeared inside the cockpit. He wasn't a pilot. He seemed to be fumbling around, desperately trying to understand the controls. Minutes later, the plane dipped left, engines began shutting down, and before long, the jet plunged into the mountains north of Athens. Everyone on board, 121 souls, were gone. That morning, Helios Airways Flight 522 had departed from Larnaca, Cyprus, heading toward Prague with a scheduled stopover in Athens. It was peak summer season, and most passengers were vacationers returning from holiday. At the controls were 2 experienced aviators, a 59-year-old captain with over 17,000 flight hours and a 51-year-old first officer with over 7,500 hours in the air. On paper, this was a seasoned crew. But behind the scenes, things weren't so smooth. The first officer had often complained to friends and colleagues about the captain's harsh and intimidating personality. The airline itself was aware of these issues. On top of that, training records showed the first officer had struggled with checklist procedures, a detail that would later prove critical. Their aircraft was a 7-year-old Boeing 737-300. Everything seemed normal as they climbed out of Cyprus airspace. But at 12,000 feet, an alarm began to sound. The sound was familiar, it was the same warning that triggers on the ground when the plane is not properly configured for takeoff. But they weren't on the ground. They were already climbing. Confused, the captain called the airline's operations center to report a takeoff configuration warning. On the ground, an engineer tried to walk him through some checks. The captain mentioned ventilation and cooling fans, and then began asking about circuit breakers. But the engineer grew confused, his answers weren't making sense. Finally, the engineer asked a critical question, "Captain, is your pressurization mode set to auto or manual?" No response. Instead, the captain repeated his earlier questions, as if he hadn't understood. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, oxygen masks had already dropped from the ceiling. Here's the tragic truth, the night before, during maintenance, an engineer had switched the cabin pressurization system from auto to manual to perform a leak test. But after finishing, he forgot to switch it back. That small oversight, just one switch left in the wrong position, meant the aircraft was climbing higher and higher without properly regulating cabin pressure. By the time the plane reached 34,000 feet, the cabin altitude was equivalent to standing on a Himalayan mountain. Within minutes, passengers and crew began experiencing hypoxia, a lack of oxygen to the brain. The effects? Confusion, poor judgment, loss of consciousness, and eventually death. The pilots should have caught the mistake during pre-flight checks. They should have noticed again before taxi. And once more after takeoff. But because they assumed the switch was already set to auto, they missed it. And when the warning horn blared, they misidentified it entirely, believing it was a takeoff configuration alarm instead of a pressurization alarm. This one mix-up sealed the fate of everyone on board. As the crew slipped into unconsciousness, the aircraft continued on autopilot, perfectly following its programmed route. Controllers tried calling over 20 times. Other aircraft were asked to relay messages. No one responded. By the time the F-16s arrived, the 737 had already circled Athens multiple times in a holding pattern, just waiting for a landing clearance it would never acknowledge. When fighter pilots looked inside, the horror became real. The captain slumped over, the first officer unresponsive, and every passenger completely still. And then, in a strange twist, a man entered the cockpit. That man was Andreas Prodromou, a flight attendant. Unlike the others, he had managed to survive longer by using a portable oxygen bottle. Andreas also happened to hold a commercial pilot's license. But there was a problem: he wasn't certified to fly a Boeing 737. The F-16 pilots reported seeing him sit in the captain's seat, put on the headset, and attempt to take control. He even waved at them. For a brief, heartbreaking moment, it seemed like hope. But then, one by one, the engines began to fail. The aircraft had been circling for so long that it was simply running out of fuel. At 9 a.m., both engines flamed out. The powerless jet banked left, then right, and within minutes slammed into the mountains, killing everyone on board. Investigators quickly traced the cause back to that single pressurization switch. The maintenance engineer had left it in manual. The crew had failed to notice. And the alarm system's confusing design meant the pilots misunderstood the danger until it was too late. Andreas's bravery was confirmed when investigators found 3 used portable oxygen bottles in the wreckage. It meant he and perhaps 2 other crew members had stayed conscious longer than the rest. On the cockpit voice recorder, Andreas's final desperate attempts to radio for help were heard, but tragically, he had forgotten to press the transmit button. Even if he had landed the jet, hypoxia had already caused irreversible brain damage to the passengers. The crash, in a sense, had become unavoidable. Helios Flight 522 forced the aviation industry to make serious changes. Boeing updated its training procedures, emphasizing the differences between pressurization warnings and takeoff configuration alarms. Airlines introduced stricter checklists, more thorough crew resource management training, and protocols to ensure maintenance errors could never go unnoticed again. Since that day, no other accident of this exact kind has happened again. The story of Helios Flight 522 is one of the most haunting in aviation history, a chilling reminder of how even the smallest oversight can spiral into tragedy. A single switch. A misunderstood alarm. And 121 lives lost. If you found this story gripping, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Rivo TV for more incredible mysteries and real-life stories from the skies. Because sometimes, truth is even stranger, and scarier, than fiction.